We've made a slot for a panel discussion, so we have all four of our morning speakers, which I think will be a really good opportunity because we need to pick up these threads together. But next up, we have Isabel Dedring, who comes to us today as the global transport leader from Arup, or for Arup, of Arup. I'll have to ask Alistair later what the correct grammar is. Isabel previously worked at the heart of London government as the mayor of London's deputy mayor for transport, and she was also a former environment officer. In the role of deputy of transport, she set policy and oversaw program delivery. As environmental advisor, she led a range of programs to improve London's environment. She oversaw the London mayor's electric vehicle delivery plan, new investment in green infrastructure, including 10,000 new trees, brought forward the low-carbon realm, working across 10 communities to deliver a 20% reduction in carbon use, and as well guided the £114 million London Green Fund, which used public investment to get involved in a low-carbon economy across London. Isabel was also the former director for the policy unit for Transport for London. So in her wide-ranging work, she's demonstrated the power of well-designed public transport and sustainability programs to drive economic development, community regeneration, and improvements to health and well-being. And if you haven't seen the warp and weft theme happening yet, right? We're continuing to build on this binding theme. At Arup, Isabel is advising on robust financing mechanisms for investment schemes and on using transport initiatives to support wider goals at the urban and regional levels. So she's here today to discuss her lessons for enhancing livability using public transport investment. Isabel Dedring.
Thank you. That's all right. Right, I think it's a bit London heavy today. I was asked to do this quite a long time ago when I just finished up at City Hall. And so people said what we'd be interested in hearing about is some of the experiences that we had in London around livability and public transport. So apologies for the London heavy vibe, but I definitely echo Alistair's point about, these are not exactly we do it so well and here you go. It's more sort of the pros and cons of some of the things that we've done. So hopefully, the fact that Phil and I have been on opposite sides of the political fence in London, it turned out, back in the day, doesn't mean that all these things will be ruled out of hand as potential lessons. So I was going to talk about today 4 basic points. How do we make our cities more livable using transport? So we do need to invest in the backbone. You need public transport that's attractive. Otherwise, the whole idea of getting people out of their cars absolutely doesn't work, and you can do travel demand management till the cows come home. Secondly, in London, 80% of our trips are on the road network. So the idea that our roads are fit for purpose today in this country, or indeed anywhere else in the world, really, is not correct. We need to bring our roads into the 21st century. Then I've brought along an example on air pollution, which is a big political topic in London, and I think a lot has been able to be done because of the political pressure that's been brought to bear on the topic. And then fourthly, big topic in London now, how can transport enable housing, regeneration, economic growth? So nobody's interested in transport as transport, really. Sad news for everyone in the transport industry. What people are interested in is what transport can actually help to deliver, and I think there's a lot of interesting read across to Cardiff at the moment and some of the discussions around transport infrastructure in the city. Trip making itself isn't the reason why people will hopefully be interested in the Cardiff Metro or the cycling strategy. It's actually about what kind of city do we want to live in, what are the challenges that we have as a city, and how can transport help deliver against those. And then I've just got some practical things that we found from some of the things that we've done, some of the practical lessons that we learned. So in terms of the investment in the public transport backbone, just really briefly to give also a sense of context. So obviously London's got a very extensive tube system as well as a commuter rail system. So 85% of the morning commute is on rail. And at the same time, so what we need to do is we need to enhance that network. You can't just say, here's a brilliant system and it's all fine, and it's regularly keeling over on all fronts. So what we need to do is to expand the system on a continuous basis. And I think if you think about Cardiff over the next several decades, what is that program that's going to continually expand the metro or the railways or cycle lanes or whatever it is that gives people that sense of ongoing development. And one of the interesting things about this project I've just brought along as an example, the Bakerloo Line extension, is that actually this has been very much driven by, apart from a random desire by Boris to have an announcement at MIPIM a couple of years ago, where we decided we were going to extend the Bakerloo Line by 2030, which has turned out to be a great catalyst for this project coming forward. But it was entirely driven by the need also to regenerate South London and what are some of the housing growth numbers that we could deliver if we looked at this kind of extension. So rather than saying we'll have a railway going there, saying where can we get housing growth in the city, where can we get the biggest impact in terms of regeneration, and that's where we're going to put the railway. So it was trying to put the whole thing, flip it on its head a bit. And then the Northern Line's being extended to Battersea. So just to give some examples of the kinds of projects that are going on, Crossrail's delivering a 10% increase in rail capacity in the peak. And again, the transport business case for Crossrail isn't that strong. It's actually all about the economic case of linking people from deprived communities in outer London and indeed beyond London's boundaries into the job opportunities in the centre of London. And of course, there's an extensive tram and light rail system in London, and that serves a function as well in parallel with the heavy rail system. So it's not as well understood or known, but that's a system that's continually being expanded and enhanced, capacity improvements, et cetera. But it's worth noting that buses actually carry far more passengers than the tube every day. So there's 6 million bus trips a day, which is roughly 50% more than we carry on the tube network. But it's a kind of underappreciated system, and those are all the bus routes. It's impossible to represent them all on one map. So what do we need to do beyond that, though? So we've got a very well-working, really, railway compared to a lot of other cities. But what do we need to do to bring our roads up to scratch? So in London, we've got about 33% car use in terms of the mode split. That's that yellow slice there. 80% of our trips are on the road network, though. When people think about roads, and I think some of the discussion around the M4 here has been in this vein too, when people think about investing in roads, they think it's all about private vehicles. So you mean that you're investing in a growth in car usage. Well, actually, if we look at London, out of the 80% of trips that are on the road network, the minority of those trips are actually in car. It's about bus use, cycling, walking, taxis, etc., and not to mention freight. And roads also represent 80% of the public space in the city. So when you think about livability and how do you make the city a nicer place to be, actually the biggest single square footage opportunity is the road network. But of course, transport agencies don't think or care about that typically because it's outside of what they consider to be their job. And if you look at the London system, it's clearly not fit for purpose in terms of what you would want for a large world city. You've got a kind of, something that burned down in the Great Fire of London, and they thought it would be a great idea to rebuild that same spaghetti in exactly the same place where it had been, despite some, ideas about having a sort of Parisian series of boulevards. So we don't really have a road system that's fit for purpose, and how do we actually get it to deliver the kind of movement and support the movement that it needs to, not to mention the public realm. And that network was then so-called improved by a whole series of interventions in the kind of glorification of the car era in the 1970s. So there's a huge number of gyratories in London that look like this and that entirely blight the surrounding area, and that's quite typical for a lot of cities in the UK. So we've got a kind of combination of pretty unfortunate investments over many hundreds of years. So what happened in London was there was a sort of outpouring of political protest, particularly around the cycle safety agenda, around 2010, 2011, and it sort of coincided with a lot of pressure around congestion getting worse and what are we doing about it. And as you can see here, this was a die-in that was held outside Transport for London's headquarters, literally hundreds of people, and that's a major junction in London, so the traffic in South London came to a complete halt. And it shows the power of political protest as a vehicle for driving change in cities, which I think, in politics, I've always really embraced, because that's how you can actually get things done and get through the treacle of the civil service, with the greatest respect to the civil service, obviously. So what do we do with that? So we instigated something called the Roads Task Force, and it brought together the freight lobby, cyclists, walkers, the Automotive Association, developers, boroughs, And, you know, so the first thing that you would think if you had all those people around a table, you'd never be able to get them to agree on anything. But it was really interesting how everybody understood that we needed a progressive agenda for the road network. Nobody thinks that we're going to be jamming more cars down our roads in the center of cities. Everybody knows that basically private vehicles won't exist in the center of cities in 50 years' time, 20 years' time. It's just a matter of time and who's going to take those steps. And out of that, what we created was a £4 billion roads investment program, which was funded primarily out of efficiencies. So we put in place an efficiencies program within the transit agency, and that was used to fund this program. And there's a really interesting thing about roads, that people have a very low level of aspiration, right? So people talk about Crossrail, £15 billion, no problem. We don't have the money, but we'll find it. The railway industry is really confident about things like HS2, you know, seemed like a crazy idea. Who's got £42 billion? Now it's being built. Whereas in the road industry, it's sort of, you know, please can we patch up this pothole, and we need 37p to do it. And so it's about raising the sights of the roads investment and saying, actually, we should be investing 30 billion, 40 billion pounds in London over the next 20, 30 years in the road network to bring the road network into the 21st century. So we had 4 major elements in this program, as you can see here. So as Alistair said, I'm not going to read it to you, but basically it involved some investment in the physical fabric of the network, a massive cycling program, which we sort of badge as Copenhagen levels of investment. So Copenhagen invests about £20 per year per person in cycling. And so we said, you know, what does that equate to in London terms? And that's what we're going to do. But then there's also all the back office intelligence, which gives you the capacity on the system. So what that meant was that first block in terms of the major junction improvements, which involved quite a lot of leverage from also the developer community, from boroughs. So we said, we've got an amount of money, but we're also looking for contributions from elsewhere. Anyone who's been to Elephant and Castle knows what a hideous location it is. And the thing that we put in place, £150 million improvement to the tube station, but also to the public realm. So we've taken an arm out of the gyratory, created a public plaza, put in cycle lanes, pedestrian crossings, etc. And again, the developer, which is located here, building about 2,000 homes, was absolutely instrumental in getting that to happen, because for them, the property values of what they were building were going to go up very significantly because of this being built. And they put some money in as well, but also supported it. Similar project, just to illustrate, up in Archway. Who even knows why there's that strange road in the middle there? And so it was pedestrianizing the very underutilized road. One of the arms doesn't allow private vehicles. So what it's doing is taking a lot of capacity out of the system for private vehicles. And then the notorious cycle superhighways, at least in London, they're very notorious. And one of the most difficult things that I had to do in my 8 years at City Hall was championing and pushing through this scheme, which is obviously brilliant, but a lot of people don't agree. So it's taking a lane out of the embankment. So the embankment was 2 lanes in each direction. It's now 3 lanes with 1 lane going east and 2 lanes going west. And it has created more congestion along that route. But for us, it wasn't just about cycling. It was about what kind of a city do we want to say we are? And this is an iconic location in London. It's along the River Thames. Big Ben is right there. Tourists come there, decision makers come there. We want to be a city that stands for these kinds of things, that we believe in green modes of transport, we believe in cycling, we're a progressive city, and this is how we signal that. So it's about far more than the cycling impact itself, although the cycling impact's been very significant. So we've seen a doubling on most of these superhighways, we've seen a doubling in the number of people cycling along them. And there's also a cycle grid in central London that's being put in place, which doesn't involve segregation, but is more about route finding, those kinds of things. And we don't need to go through this, but the important point is that the way that we did all of this was in part by creating additional capacity on the network. So the whole problem with roads is that when you say, oh, here's a thing that you can have, private car driver or cyclist or freight industry, everybody thinks it's a zero-sum game. If I give something to that guy, it means I'm taking it away from someone else. So what we did is through a whole range of measures, we actually created a significant extra capacity through operational measures on the network. So that's about operating the traffic signals better. It's about clearing up accidents faster. It's about, for example, using laser scanners at accident sites, and that actually brought down the time for the police to clear up accidents from 8 hours to about 2 hours. And that all has an impact on decongesting the network, and that creates more capacity in the system. And then with that capacity, you can reassign it to pedestrians, to cyclists, wherever you want to put it. So the result of all of this has been in London over the last 15 years, not just under Boris, but under Ken as well, is that there's been a 30% drop in traffic in central London. And congestion, although it's gone up a bit recently, partly because of the construction of the cycle superhighways, and there's been a huge amount of building construction in the last 18 months or so. But congestion's broadly stayed flat. Traffic's gone down. That doesn't make sense until you recognize that capacity's been taken out. But the result of that, basically, the net of that, is that we've been able to preserve journey time reliability for drivers. So the message to drivers has not been, you know, it's all going to be wonderful, we're going to get rid of congestion, but it's also not been, it's going to get terrible because we've got this progressive strategy to make your life hell. So we've managed to maintain reliability flat whilst creating a lot of these improvements on the road network. One of the topics I spent a lot of time on, both when I was looking after transport as well as in the environment brief, was air pollution. And the reason that it's a big topic in London is, well, A, top left corner, we do have an air pollution problem. So the red and orange bits show you where we're violating the European limit values. And despite some initial, I think, glee in some quarters after Brexit that we don't have to worry about these anymore. But unfortunately and fortunately, we've got campaigners like Simon Burkett in London on the bottom left, who's now a good friend, and who obviously would not allow the removal of the European limit values to be an excuse for not doing anything anymore on air pollution. And he's actually single-handedly transformed the debate on air quality in the city and made it a top political topic within transport and beyond, despite the fact that we had an air quality strategy. That's on the top right. Nobody really cared about it until he came along, and he just made it into a huge topic and was very good at generating a lot of PR about, how many people die every year in London, the fines that we were facing from Europe. And so that created a sort of burning platform politically off of which we could do things. So the kinds of things that we've been able to do in London, and I think this is a really important intervention that transport can make to make cities more livable, not just from an air pollution perspective, but from a carbon perspective, and as well as, again, signaling what kind of a city do we want to be. So we tightened up the restrictions on the congestion charge, so that meant that you can only drive for free in central London if you have basically a near zero emission vehicle, whereas previously, as long as you were sort of 20-30% lower emission, that was fine. We extended the low emission zone, which covers all of London, to LGVs, so that means white van man, which is obviously a core Tory voter, and we did that a year before the 2012 mayoral election, so that was pretty torrid, because 70,000 white van drivers in London, probably 99% of whom had voted for Boris, and he definitely won by a smaller margin in 2012, and probably almost exactly equivalent to the number of white van drivers in London. But we've cleaned up the white van fleet, so it was all worth it in the end, although a lot of people in the Tory party wouldn't necessarily thank me for saying that. The other thing that we've done is introduce sort of large-scale rollout of low-emission buses. So this is one of those things where everybody thinks, oh, electric buses, they're like the little airport bus, right? But they could never be used in real operation for serious, things that are happening in cities. And actually what we found is that 20% of the electric bus routes in London could be converted to electric tomorrow because of the operating parameters and the duty cycles. And actually, we've put in a requirement that by 2020, all of the single-deck buses operating in central London will have to be zero emission. So they don't have to be electric, but that is the most affordable, realistic option. At the moment, it's had a huge transformative impact, A, on price, B, on the industry in terms of generating more flow of vehicles coming into the market. We've had new players come into the market as well. So it's been really exciting seeing how policymaking can actually catalyze change in the marketplace. And in fact, another example is they finally decided to invent an electric double-deck bus, which for many decades people said was impossible. So here's one that we're trialing at the moment in London. And in a similar example, we set a requirement that all new black cabs coming into the market in January 2018 onwards have to be zero emission. So they have to be able to run in London in electric mode. And there's an entirely new factory in Coventry that's being built by the Chinese who bought the London Taxi Company, and that's where they're building not only the taxis, but the chassis and the motor and the drivetrain technology is being used to also build electric vans, family vehicles, et cetera. So again, if it weren't for that guaranteed deal flow that we've created through the policy making, you wouldn't have seen that kind of investment happening. And I think, I'd like to see a lot more of that linkage between the industrial strategy that we don't have, but apparently we're going to have one, and policy making in this country, because that link needs to and could be a lot tighter. And finally, we've introduced the ultra-low emission zone in London, or we've announced that we're going to have it in London from 2020. And in a good step forward, the new mayor, Sadiq Khan, has said that he wants to try and introduce it earlier and expand the footprint of it. And this has not generated any particular interest or outcry, and I think it's because nobody's noticed it, because it actually sets a Euro 6 requirement for almost all vehicles coming into the center of London, which is a very strict requirement, and most vehicles that are currently driving in London would not qualify for that. So I'm hoping that somebody else will get blamed for that in due course. But it's a fantastic intervention, I think, and it's going to really change not only the pollution in the city, but I think probably traffic volumes will be significantly affected as well. So then finally, transport is an enabler. People talk about this a lot, but what does it really mean in practice? So in London, we have a population of 8 million people, and Phil talked earlier about the growth that's expected in Cardiff, 26% in terms of population growth. So London's got something quite similar, roughly sort of 2 million extra people expected on top of the 8 million over the next 20 years or so. And the issue in London is it's very low density. There's a lot of politics around putting in higher density. So what we've tried to say over 10, 15 years as London government is to try and concentrate growth in particular areas where there's real opportunity to regenerate certain locations. But when you start to look at why hasn't growth happened in these places, a lot of them are really central. Typically, it's because of connectivity. There's usually a reason why the market hasn't developed these locations, and it's because in about 60% of the cases is because transport's not adequate to that site. So here's just one example of quite a few of how we've tried to redress that. So this is a site on the north side of the river, Barking, right near where Ulster School is. And 11,000 homes supposed to go into this site. Huge housing crisis in London. I mean, absolutely, by far the top issue. But for whatever reason, over 20, 30 years, this site wasn't being developed. It's a lovely location. I'm sure it will look nothing like the sort of, blue sky version on the top right-hand corner, but it's family homes, very affordable. But it turns out it takes an hour and a half roughly to get into the center of the city because there's a bus and then you take the light railway and, by the time you got there, it's lunchtime. So what we did was extend the heavy rail network down into that site. And I guess really the point is that site is now being brought forward, all those homes are being built, and so it really has unlocked that location, and it shows very directly the relationship between transport and development and regeneration. The other thing that's interesting is that the transit agency will never invest in these sorts of things because basically the first few years after you build it, you're kind of carrying oxygen around and you're building a railway to a swamp where lots of frogs live, but there aren't very many people there. And so therefore, from a transport assessment perspective, it will never be at the top of the list. So what we did was we ring-fenced a pot of money within the transit agency and put it sort of outside of the normal funding process, and we used some of that to help catalyze the growth in this location. And Bakerloo Line Extension I talked about earlier, but just to say, again, the whole case for this is all built around housing. It isn't built around transport. Obviously, there's massive transport benefits to this project, but primarily it's about unlocking housing growth in that location. And indeed, the funding of this scheme is based on the uplift in values that's created by building this. So that's not the only source of money, but there's a significant source of funding from business rates and from new development value capture that's brought into the scheme, and that's what makes it affordable. It makes the difference between being able to build this and not being able to build it. And Crossrail, as I said earlier, also the entire case based on enabling housing growth, enabling regeneration, not just on transport. So when you think about this, so how can we kind of take this to the next level? And I think there's some relevance for Cardiff, where I think the level of aspiration and ambition here is really impressive and significant. But 1.2 billion from the city deal will be, 1.2 billion. Transport people can spend that in a week. That's like a drop in the ocean in transport terms. So just trying to think about how can we kind of leverage that more extensively. And one of the things that the transport industry in general globally is trying to move towards is harnessing more explicitly where the benefits are. So, we don't have to read this in detail, but the basic concept is the people who benefit from transport aren't just the people who are taking the transport system. There's benefits to society generally in terms of supporting the economy. There's benefits to existing and future landowners. There's benefits to the people using and operating the system. And how do we get everybody to pay a little bit more that reflects the fairly what the impact and benefit has been for them, rather than saying the public purse should pay, and then all the landowners along the line of route and all the businesses are going to have a massive benefit, but that's just windfall for them, and nice for them, but not so great for us as public sector decision makers. And just to illustrate this, in London, what we've found, and this is actually replicated all around the world, broadly speaking, these are roughly the numbers that you would see. So if you have a rail station, what you'll see is that properties around the rail station within 400, 500 meters will be 10% more valuable than properties beyond that mark. And you can see it sort of falls off as you get further and further away from the railway station. So obviously, if you build a new railway station, you're going to see that kind of impact. But if you upgrade a system so that you go from 1 train an hour, 2 trains an hour, to 4 or 5 trains an hour, what transport calls turn up and go, which makes a huge impact on ridership, then you're going to see that kind of impact as well. So just think about how we can harness that, and I'll just give one example, which is the Northern Line extension. So this is an extension down to Battersea, where the Battersea Power Station is, made famous by the Pink Floyd album cover, and it's got very high level of heritage status, extraordinarily enough, but anyway, it has it. And so there's a huge development down there that's planned. And basically, the recognition was that this site has been sitting there for 20, 30 years. Nothing's really happened. It's within 15 minutes walk of Parliament. So that's not logical. What's going on? One of the problems is connectivity. And so this project's been brought forward. It's £1 billion, basically, to build the tube line out there. And what's happened is that the way it's being paid for is through that pink sort of hashed zone is the enterprise zone that's been created, which is very different, I gather, from the enterprise zones that exist here. So what it is it ring fences the business rates and says any increase in business rates in this area, you don't have to pay anymore, so there's no higher rate that's paid. But whatever happens in this area to lift business rates is ring fenced from the Treasury and used and borrowed against to pay for the tube extension. So that generates 1.7 billion expected revenues, and we've borrowed against that as City Hall, backed off by central government, and that is what's paying for the tube extension. So there's no cash, grant money, or anything from the public sector. The public sector's role is to guarantee and take the risk off on the project. And you don't need to go down this extreme road where this whole thing is paid for through the uplift in business rates, but it's these kinds of techniques that increasingly the transport industry is looking at to think about paying for transport infrastructure. So just finally, a few experiences that I've had in terms of how you go about doing this. So, and some of this may be kind of obvious, but how do we deliver this in terms of strategy and funding? One of the things that we found in London, but also now in my new role going to lots of cities around the world, the classic mistake or situation that people find themselves in is that they end up with a whole laundry list of projects that everybody wants to do, and a lot of them have probably been sitting around for several decades, but there isn't a coherent argument about where are we trying to go as a city, as a region, over the next 20, 30 years, what are the economic outcomes that we want, and then driving the projects off of that rather than having a bun fight between the different projects. And it helps by having the argument at that level and having a discussion at that level and then falling down into the projects. It reduces a lot of the politics around individual projects because there's an agreement up front about where are we trying to go collectively as a city. And then you need the transport strategy to underpin that, ideally, and then the projects sit underneath that. And I guess, some of this is blindingly obvious, but people do forget that you cannot make these kinds of improvements unless you've got an adequate level of funding. So making sure that you've got high quality public transport isn't free. There's lots of different ways you can pay for it, though. So it's being more creative about the range of different tools that you can use. And as I said, the broader outcomes of transport are never factored in for transport organization, and expecting that they will isn't going to happen because they just don't assess projects in that way. So for us, political will has been really important to overcome that, and there isn't really another way around that. And finally, on the strategy and funding front, we just don't have the institutional capability within public institutions to think more creatively about how we can deliver big railway projects in terms of bringing in new funding streams, but we also don't really have the capability in this country at least, and in a lot of other cities in the world, to really deliver sort of progressive road strategies. It's a big challenge for us with the cycling program in London, for example, getting the right kind of people to actually design the right kind of cycling infrastructure and getting the institution at the management level to buy into that was extremely challenging. So it's all well and good to come up with, our brilliant plans for what we're going to do, but it's actually getting that to be delivered is very difficult. And finally, sort of political momentum. we found in London that, having a burning platform for anything always really helps. People tend to not do anything unless they're scared for some reason, sadly enough. And the case for investment really needs a very simple narrative. What's the 20-second soundbite that the politician is going to give when the TV camera is stuck in his face is a question for all of us as an industry. It's not a question for the politicians, and we blame him when he doesn't get it right. It's actually a question that the industry as a whole needs to kind of align behind. Otherwise, these projects are not going to get off the ground because public support is key, and the only way that you're going to build that is by having a clear narrative that plugs into what people actually want. They're not really interested in transport infrastructure, typically. So if you talk to people around this city, in the valleys, et cetera, they'll all give a different answer about what are the top 2, 3 things they want from in their lives, in their communities. And it's probably not going to be, I'd like 4 trains an hour instead of 2 trains an hour. It's not going to be at that level. It certainly isn't in London. For us, business support was an absolutely crucial factor for success in London, and it's getting businesses to buy into the economic narrative rather than arguing over individual projects, and having one business organization that sort of speaks with one voice for the business community in the city was imperative. And if we hadn't had that for Crossrail and some of the other big projects, not to mention the program of sort of progressive policies for the road network, we would never have been able to deliver half the things that we were able to deliver. So that's one of the things for me that, often people don't fully recognize the importance of that. And then finally, individual champions are totally essential, and I think you've got some here in Cardiff that some of whom I've met. And how do you actually get those people sort of mobilized and get things to happen? Simon Burkett on the air pollution agenda, he has changed everything in London about air pollution pretty much on his own, tapping into a lot of us who were like-minded. And so it's sort of liberating some of those people and helping them to achieve change rather than expecting large institutions on their own to change. So I'll leave it there, and happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
So is there anyone who would like to start us off with a question? There's someone right in the back row there, I see. The microphone is coming back.
Isabel, hi. Kane Thomas, Garden and Theobald. The level of funding that a city such as London can raise is never going to be the same as a provincial city such as Cardiff. How is a provincial city going to raise that type of capital funding and be able to support the infrastructure upgrades? Albeit the city deal, the city region deal is good for Cardiff, but it's not the answer to the question. So what other funding vehicles do you think there are for a city such as Cardiff?
Yeah, I think obviously the quantum isn't the same, but nor should it be, right? Because the city's much smaller. So, 15 billion pounds for Crossrail, but you don't need a Crossrail that's 15 billion pounds worth. So I don't think I would agree that the kind of appropriate level of funding, as in if you were to sort of gross it down for the number of people living in Cardiff, isn't achievable. And I do think that there's such a wide range of tools that you can use that the idea that, we can't access any of that whizzy stuff, whether it's value capture, whether it's business rate ring fencing, whether it's sponsorship, for example, whether it's land sales, joint development of land, there's a whole range of techniques that you can use. And I guess the point is really just to start looking at some of those things and seeing which of those might be relevant in the Cardiff context. But certainly looking at other cities, there's a lot of other cities globally that are about Cardiff's size that are looking at these kinds of techniques. And yeah, the property values are lower here, but it's all about the growth rate and how we actually go about capturing what. It isn't necessarily about the kind of level of value that people are at the moment. And so there's a lot of different techniques that you can use. There's a project in Washington, D.C. which is quite a small city actually, which is, sort of 50 million pounds overall size of the project. And they've used a lot of really innovative techniques in order to pay for that look at kind of the impact on the broader area. They capture some of the value on top of the station. And, so those kinds of techniques can be brought to bear in smaller settings. It's just about looking at what's, as you say, sort of what's appropriate in that setting. But it's definitely not a case that those techniques just aren't accessible to a smaller city. Oh. This is the problem with being the person before the coffee, Alison. I'm keeping all these people from their coffee.
You're okay, aren't you?
Don't worry. 5 minutes, and then you'll have your coffee.
Hi, Isabel. Graham Marshall. I'm running a workshop this afternoon as well, so my stuff's up there. Just a comment, really, not a question. Probably 2 lifetimes ago now, I worked on a lot of movement transport projects within London. And I do know that, referring to the last question, that it's not a project or not a project. There's steps, and it takes a long time to deliver projects. The DLR was known as a noddy railway system that ran through London, but the promoters of that saw it as a piece of string to later pull a bigger rope through. And that piece of string got Canary Wharf built, which then brought an economy, which then brought the Jubilee Line extension, which is now holding up, bringing Crossrail in. So Crossrail didn't just happen as a project. It's had other steps in that system as well.
Yeah, and I think totally agree. And one of the things that's interesting about the DLR, about the light railway, and what's interesting about light rail generally, it can carry a lot fewer people, but you can build it out in a more modular way. And when the DLR, and you'll know this, when the DLR first came to London, it was very much a way of getting, bankers who lived somewhere else, Alistair was talking about earlier, out to Canary Wharf. But a lot of people who lived in those communities saw it as nothing to do with them. It was something traveling over their heads, and almost out of principle, people wouldn't, there were communities where people out of principle wouldn't take it because it was, that was for those bankers that are going over there and it's nothing to do with us. And we had to work really hard at the time to try and draw those communities into using that form of transport, which has now changed a lot. So I guess the point is, if you tried to say to those communities when the DLR first started, hey, here's this brilliant network and you're going to be able to move all around East London and come into Central London and go to jobs, and that wouldn't have worked at all. So you have to kind of slowly turn up the temperature of the water, don't you? Yeah, but it's about having that understanding of where we can get to as a city over the next 20 to 30 years and bringing people along with that over time incrementally. I agree with you.
But you're all inherent in that, Inherent in that is also then at the risk of stepping on all the small people who feel like they're not getting listened to for this big investment. So you do have to have some strong political will to bring it in. To bring that string in, and you've got to somehow deliver a message that, no, we are listening to you.
Yeah, and something we're working on at the moment in my new job is the way the transport industry talks about all projects is, we have an idea, we go away for 2 years and we sit in a darkened room and come up with all these brilliant technical designs, and we, figure out exactly how many carriages, what the color of the train's going to be, what exactly the signaling system's going to look like, and then, it's like, ta-da, here's this amazing thing. And we expect the public to say, that's so wonderful. I've been waiting for this thing all my life. And most people, by definition, will say, I don't like it because they didn't have anything to do with developing it. Whereas some of the experiences I've had that have worked better, and I've had a lot of bad experiences as well, is where we've said, we want to do something here, and we want to make an investment, but we're not sure what that could look like, and you help us, tell us what your problems are, and we'll design a thing that responds to whatever you think your problems are. And that's much more effective, and it reduces the amount of political argy-bargy downstream by a lot. But the transport industry doesn't work that way at the moment. But, that's where we need to get to as an industry. Sorry.
Hi, Isabel. Steve Dimmick from Dupol. I was wondering how far into the future you look when creating these kind of projects. So the drive behind a lot of the work being done is regeneration, and I think you cited the idea of bringing people into better paid jobs in central London, etc. I wonder how long and hard you think about AI and automation and the fact that accelerating into the future, lower paid jobs, mid-paid jobs, for instance, all of the tube drivers, all of the bus drivers will no longer have fit employment. Could there be a chance that the developments you're making become white elephants, that ultimately they don't get the usage that you currently predict because of the improvements in technology?
Yeah, I think there's maybe 2 different points within that. It's a really important point, and I think the infrastructure industry in general is really poor at future casting, partly because they want to believe that, okay, if there's 10 million people doing 20 million trips today, there'll be 20 million people doing 40 million trips. That was easy. I just multiplied it times 2. And that is the quality of the thinking, I would say, generally in the industry. Overall, around the world, there's a lot of that kind of thinking, and people haven't quite got their heads around. Nobody's really got their heads around the kind of disruptive change that you're talking about. The one thing I would say is that we need to differentiate between how transport's going to be delivered and whether there's bus drivers or not, but people are still going to want to travel. And one thing that's really interesting is over the last 10, 20 years, people have said with the rise of digital and video conferencing and all these things, people will travel less because they don't need to travel. But there's some interesting academic studies that show that over many thousands of years, people have always traveled sort of the same amount, and they've roughly done similar amount of time and number of trips every day. And what we've actually seen over the last, and not just in London, but looking at other cities as well, even since the iPhone was introduced in 2007, we've seen a growth in trip rates that's higher than the population growth. So more people, for whatever reason, people are wanting to travel more. I don't know whether it's a way of getting out of the digital bubble and experiencing the real world. So I think it's important to differentiate between how transport's going to be delivered and whether people are going to be making lots of trips and whether we need to connect people into other parts of the city. That will continue to be the case, in my view.
Was there one very quick question? No? Yes? Can we have the last quick question, and then we will release you for your coffee.
I'm fine.
Or tea. But Isabel obviously can stay here all day. But
Hi, sorry. Andrew Gibson, Cushman Wakefield. Probably a little less long in the tooth than quite a lot of the guys in the room today, but I've been working in the industry, property industry in particular now, for some 12 years. And we've had a great amount of growth here in Cardiff. You know, it's been a fantastic time to be involved in Cardiff generally. But shortfall really for me is the M4 relief system, which obviously Arup are leading the charge on in part. I just wonder, in your opinion, we take the electrification as obviously a massive positive. Central Square and everything they're doing there is obviously huge. But for me, the M4 relief needs to be prioritised probably beyond every project that we are talking about in Wales. How do you deliver something of that scale, you know, now? I suppose, what's the way, from your opinion, to get that project off the floor tomorrow? Because it really, in my view, for me, who's going to be in this industry for hopefully another 30 plus years, it's a big must.
I've learned from painful experience not to go to other cities and comment on, here's the answer. I was saying to Phil last night, okay, I've been here for 10 hours. I have all the answers for Cardiff. It's really easy to do that, isn't it? So rather than commenting on the scheme itself, but one of the things that we found with that roads task force work that we did and the road strategy that we produced, it was absolutely essential to get all the different people in a room together. So for example, part of what we said as part of the road strategy for London, there's no proper strategic roads in London at all. If you look at all the motorways, they kind of come just across the M25 and then they just stop. And the orbital road for London is one lane in some places in each direction, which is, insane. But when you try and start to talk about building new roads, there's a lot of people who will come out of the woodwork and say that's, a backward step, reactionary, pro-car, whatever. And what we tried to do was to say it's a mix of all of these different things. And one of the things that you can do by building, strategic road capacity is that you can then take the road capacity in the center of the city and you can give it to cyclists, pedestrians, public plazas, and all those sorts of things. And that actually doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have more drivers. In fact, some of the strategic roads that we've suggested for London over the last few years, they would just move the drivers to a different location so that you could create actually housing on some of those sites. In fact, we've been looking at a project out in East London, the A13, which is massive blight on that community. It's basically a motorway along the Thames that segregates a very poor community and makes it even poorer, generates a lot of pollution. So the idea would be to put it underground. You can put a linear park on top with 5,000 houses, and actually the business case for it is incredibly good because there's nothing there at the moment. So you're going to generate all this housing land where currently there's just tarmac. And so it's kind of trying to tell that story, which is about, it isn't about a sort of retrograde step. It's actually about it's a progressive step. And cities like Oslo, which were referenced earlier, are doing those sorts of things precisely in order to create a more livable and green city.
Thank you, Isabel. Okay, now I think we can be released for our coffee, tea, and whatnot. So if you go upstairs, just up the stairs where we had coffee this morning, we'll have coffee, a bit of a break. I'll say the loos and whatnot are downstairs one level, I believe is the closest place. So we'll reconvene here in about 10 minutes, all right? Thank you.